bring that up. Well, now if you're online, you can see with Officer Discussion Group 3, here's what I was talking about as far as, the start of that Officer Discussion Group 3, which I won't go back through. But as we continue that discussion, though, we'll bring in some concepts that currently aren't part of the presentation, and Briggs and I will have to talk about that because I am still in a holding pattern on certain things. So Briggs and I have talked a little bit about it. We're probably just going to roll with what we got because that's what we're prepared to roll with. But there are, in the risk model for Sigma Chi, 6 truths of feedback. So you can see that on the screen now if you're online. Just having a little bit more dialogue about the importance of feedbacks with the undergrads. And some of these were actually in the presentation that Briggs was talking about that I thought I was sharing that you guys weren't seeing. But you told him, I think you heard him say, and if I remember right, you've mentioned, multiple times, we're going to be stressing to them that this is a valuable gift. We want them to understand that we want to have appreciative, constructive feedback. It's got to be two-way communication. It's got to be frequent. You can see right there. It's more than just choosing the right words. It's how we present. It's our vocal variety. It's the body language that we use. The manner in which Stu and Riggs are going to deliver their presentations to the undergrads, and how they talk, the tone of their voice, how they move. That's actually going to be part of that presentation and affect the receiver of that information. So we want these guys to understand that. Sorry, guys. Every time somebody jumps in, it kicks me out. Interesting. So we're going to continue on that discussion with the 6 truths. We want to start connecting feedback to the position of Quaestor. So we're going to ask them for examples on, what are some of the common feedback examples that you're going to have to deliver in relationship to your role, and get them talking a little bit about that model. What is it that you're going to have to report? What is the impact going to be? What are the specific behaviors that we prefer as it relates to our position? And if we can push for and obtain those types of behaviors, what are the positive consequences that are going to come out of it? We want them to talk about that so they understand it. We also want to talk a little bit about the receiver role too. A lot of times in feedback, we're going to talk about, giving feedback to others. But we also need to understand, if we're going to be effective leaders in our chapters and beyond, how do we receive that information? So are we going to be able to listen and manage our reactions? Or are we going to try and justify whatever feedback we're getting if it was related to our behavior, something we said or did? Are we going to make sure that we are clarifying what the person is saying? Because everybody, talks a little different and means things a little bit differently. And furthermore, is accepting that feedback and making the necessary adjustments. That's another part of this leadership piece. These guys need to understand. Not only do you have to understand leadership concepts, not only do you have to be able to give people feedback, you got to be able to receive it properly as well. And then, finally, for this part of the discussion, we'll talk about the benefits and challenges of giving and receiving feedback, because it's not an easy thing. So we'll do a little bit of role play and a little bit of scenario-based discussion to go through that. Here you can see, here's the risk discussion scenario 1. So what we want to do is, rather than just give them information and say, this is what feedback's about, go do it, we actually want to throw some scenarios at them that we can talk through and give them the opportunity to digest the information that's in the scenario, and then figure out how to use the feedback model to begin that process of communication. The example here that is written has to do with some financial hardships that one of the members of the chapter is going through. He doesn't have anybody that can financially help him. He's increasing his hours at work. He's having a hard time meeting the payment plan that's been put in place for him. And the Quaestor is now trying to figure out how to deal with this. Very common in undergraduate life. Kids like to go out. They like to party. In the scenario, it's even in there that that's something that this brother's doing. Spending the little bit of money that he has, knowing as the Quaestor he's having financial trouble, he's still going out and partying and doing all these things instead of meeting his financial obligation to the chapter. So in this model, we're basically saying, okay, here's the scenario. Now you as the facilitator walk these undergrads through, how are we going to use the risk feedback model to report the behavior that's going on? Because let's face it, in a lot of chapters, the Quaestor is really the only one that knows what's going on as far as the finances are concerned, unless they have a good financial committee or alumni support. So many Quaestors aren't going to have that. So how are we going to report this behavior? How are you going to give feedback to the executive committee or your financial committee on how it's impacting the chapter? What is the behavior that we need to get out of it? And what are those consequences going to be? So hopefully, if we work them through the scenario and give them the opportunity to work the model and discuss it, they'll get a greater appreciation for and understanding of these 4 areas of report, impact, specify, and consequences within the risk model. I want to stop right there for just a second, because I know, for some of the guys that are new to the team, you're listening in and saying, okay, we'll do that. For some of the guys that have been on the team for a while, we really haven't run a lot of scenario-based stuff. So I want to see if there's any questions on, the scenario format and what our goal is. None right now. We think we got it.
Hey, Johnny.
Yeah, go ahead.
Johnny, this is Scott. Give me a sense of how the breakout groups are going to work and what the size is. I mean, I get the concept that they'll present the model to the wider group, but then how does the breakdown of the smaller groups work?
Sure. So when you get into these smaller groups, typically what you're going to have is probably anywhere from 6 to 9 guys in your group. It depends on how many register, but my goal is to not have more than 8 or 9 guys in a small group discussion, so that we get enough ideas flowing around the room, but not so many people that they all can't participate. The other thing that we do, and this could actually help with these scenario discussions as well, especially when they get into talks about things relevant to their chapter, they're also going to be sorted by chapter size, chapter budgets, whether they live in a house or not. So hopefully, and we've experienced this many years in Team Quaestor, that by separating the guys like that, they have more commonality in the scenarios they're going to face. And that is what tended to be a major part of their experience at Balfour. They can identify with everybody in the room. So that's what it's going to kind of look like, is 8, 9 guys that are having a very similar experience in Sigma Chi. That's not to say that they're not from different areas of the country or Canada and that they have completely different perceptions, but as far as budgets are concerned, as far as whether they all live in a house together or not is concerned, it's going to be very similar. So good question.
Got it. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions on the scenario format as it pertains to the risk model? All good there. Oh, 1 second, kick me out again.
Hey Johnny, this is Pete, man. I just landed and I just jumped on a little bit, catching the last of the call.
Thanks, brother. Good to hear from you. We're just getting ready to get into some values-based decision-making, man. So, sure you're ready to go. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So I just kind of breezed through that last slide. It was basically a second scenario. And what the goal is going to be on the risk model is you take the time that you need as a facilitator to go through the discussion and the debrief, but then go through a scenario to get them to understand it. And I wanted to make the point, because I advanced through it. The goal of this is not necessarily to solve the problem in the scenario. Of course, we want to do that, but the focus that you should be taking as the facilitator is working them through the process itself. So as long as they're getting processed, that is what we're really trying to strive for. Because what's going to happen next is after we have the risk model, we're going to talk about values-based decision-making, and we're going to have more scenarios to talk about as it relates to the values decision-making model. And again, we're going to be focusing on process here. So on the screen now, as long as I'm still sharing, you can see the values-based decision-making model. We went over this, briefly at the very beginning of our team discussions, and this is part of the Leadership Continuum video that's on our training videos page. We're going to now take this values-based decision-making model and tie it into our Quaestor curriculum itself and our facilitation. And I just got the chapter book that the undergrads are going to get when they get to Balfour. A little bit surprised to see, because we were kind of told that it probably would be, the values-based decision-making model is not in it. But as I want us to develop ourselves in our facilitation skills towards a leadership theory that exists within Sigma Chi, I think that bringing in values-based decision-making is very relevant, and I'm sure that since it's in the continuum, it'll be in future years. So we're going to kind of get a head start on it. We talked about the risk model and the discussion group that follows for discussion group 3. Discussion group 4 and 5 is going to be based on values-based decision-making model. And in order to get us to understand that, we want to have scenarios kind of akin to the old guys who remember the parking lot model that I've been trying to stray away from a little bit. It was, okay, let's come to Balfour in the first meeting. We're going to find out your expectations. You tell me the one thing you have to get out of Balfour for you to believe it's going to be successful. And, we put 9 ideas up on the board, and then we have conversations about it for 4 days, and the guys leave with 1 or 2 good ideas for something they wanted to talk about. I personally look at Balfour and go, well, they're coming to Balfour because they don't really know what they need to get leadership development-wise. That's the point of going to the seminar. It's not that I'm not concerned with them having conversations about what matters to them at their chapters, but before they leave Balfour, I want them to understand through your facilitation a process to solve any problem, not just one specific thing like, oh, we have a hard time with fundraising. This is where values-based decision-making comes in. So in Officer Group 4 and 5, which is going to be Friday night and Saturday morning, you're going to have about 3.5 hours to first briefly introduce values-based decision-making. I don't want to harp on this. I don't want you spending a lot of time on it. You're going to see in the manual, and if you're online, you can see it here. It's 1 page. It's a description of, some of the common challenges Quaestors face. Here's the values-based decision-making model, and there's some talking points for each of the 6 components of it. I just want you guys to run through it. You don't have to spend an hour on this, but if they can get the concept of, hey, we have to define what our issue is. We have to generate some potential solutions. We have to take those solutions and measure them against some criteria, that criteria being the values of Sigma Chi, our guiding principles, right? How it's going to impact our chapter. We want them to have some level of understanding. You got to measure these things before you make a decision. Then make that decision, set your action plans, and execute. And when you're done executing, we follow up and review. I just want them to understand that. At some point here, because we're just getting this information and developing some of it, we'll create a form for this that is downloadable. And my understanding is that Sigma Chi is going to have one available potentially at some point too, that they can go online, print out a 1-pager that helps them run this process. So in discussion group 4, we just want to, spend 15, 20 minutes at the outset reaching the conversation with them about the values-based decision-making model and why it's important for them as a leader. And then we're going to dive into our values-based decision-making model scenarios. And the point of the scenarios is to give them there's a good chance that you could face something like this as Quaestor. So we're taking this model and relating it back to our specific office. Here's the scenario. It's very common, and we want to, as a group, start working the values-based decision-making model to help solve the problem. So again, it's a little bit less about solving the problem. The process should do that anyway, but it's getting them through the process so they understand it. So that if they can understand this process, the success that they could have back at their chapter solving any problem hopefully increases. So the scenario that was developed by Stu and Wes, and Dan Congista and Mitch, to make sure that it's realistic, but then to also tie it back into the model itself with questions. Now, I've got a modified version up here on the screen when it's fully done. This content that you're seeing on the webinar is actually in the manual now on the website. I'm not even sure I got it into Dropbox yet, but those 4 guys have done a great job not only coming up with the scenarios, but coming up with the questions that need to be asked in relation to those 6 components of the model to help drive the conversation, especially for the undergrads when they go home.